Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Premier Pundits podcast. It's me, Ben Dinnery, and I'm back with the fantasy doc himself. It's been a while. It's Raj Brar from 3CB Performance. Raj, how are you, my friend? It's been a few weeks since we last seen you.
Yeah, it has been. A couple of weeks. Thought it might be a bit of a break. There's never any breaks, and so then right into Euros, right?
Yeah, we're cracking the whip. I know we didn't talk heading into that last weekend of the Premier League season with a quick turnaround in fixtures, and then we've been pulling the data, and of course the Euros it just crept up on we again before we know it, and I suppose that leads us nicely into the conversation to kick off this Euro special. Given the fact that we know the Premier League is, in terms of its intensity, the energy, we're off the back of this congested schedule. We've had additional international fixtures thrown in there this season. We've had, like I say, just the shortest pre-season ever on record. I mean, are the cards stacked against England heading into this tournament, who are, quite rightly, one of the favourites to lift this European tournament?
Yeah, I think absolutely there's going to be some tilting of the field against England for all those reasons. And then, of course, you now have news that Rashford may not be fit, or he's always carrying injuries, but now he might be carrying a significant one, potentially needing that foot or ankle surgery. They're awfully quiet about that. We'll see. Sterling has kind of been out of form as well. And then you add in, like you said, just the exhaustion of the players. So yeah, definitely not ideal circumstances.
And looking at Gareth Southgate's squad and some of those selections, I mean, were there any surprises in there? The two that sort of spring to mind would be maybe Jordan Henderson, who had surgery back in March and failed to play any Premier League minutes during the remainder of the season. And also Harry Maguire as well, who we know missed that Europa League final due to an ankle ligament problem.
Yeah, I mean, I expected both to be there just because for the leadership aspect. We know both of those guys are key vocal leaders, captains on their respective clubs, and also considered leaders for the England team. And so whether that they're able to play effectively or not, I thought he might just bring them on just for that stabilizing presence off the pitch and possibly on the pitch.
Yeah, and do you think, I mean, from the limited information that we have and based on the timelines and time scales with those injuries, would you think it more realistic that Gareth Southgate, will probably look to err on the side of caution, particularly during maybe those group games, and introduce those players from the bench to gradually integrate them into the tournament?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you need some bounce games, especially when it comes to this intensity of matches. Maguire, it was funny, people were talking about him coming back for the Europa League final. It was always pie in the sky, right, with the high ankle sprain. Henderson coming back from an adductor injury that required surgery. These are sensitive injuries. And these guys have seen, and these are relatively later on in their career, especially Henderson. So you have a little bit more wear and tear and fatigue on them already. So you need to, like you said, I think use the group stage as almost a acclimation phase for them, and then potentially bring them in for more minutes as you get into the knockout rounds.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully the group stage itself should be, I see maybe Croatia as being our one, maybe potential sort of banana skin. Otherwise, we should see England comfortably through. And then dependent on other results, we face some tough teams in those knockout stages. So, they could be coming back just at the right moment. One of those possibly could be, again, another one of the tournament favourites, and that's Belgium. But again, Roberto Martinez, he hasn't had the ideal build up to this tournament. And of course, I'm referring to Kevin De Bruyne. Now, he suffered a nasal fracture and an orbital fracture in that Champions League final in that challenge with Antonio Rudiger. Now, at the time, Roberto Martinez said, look, he was released from hospital, which was a good sign. He said that, if he had have required surgery at that point, that would have ruled him out for the tournament. He had a few days away from the squad, but then we heard over the weekend that Kevin De Bruyne only, rejoined the group on Monday after a minor surgical procedure on his eye. Now, what would be the sort of risk factors associated with, maybe a return to the squad, just given that short amount of time, post-op?
Yeah, I mean, there's always a risk factor there, right? Considering he did need a procedure in this case. Although the fact from I was reading about it was a 20-minute procedure. So it sounds very, very mild. Typically, the research shows, when I was reading about orbital fractures, about 20 to 21 day typical return to play process. And the player will wear a mask to try to absorb some of that contact there potentially. But, with football, it's a sport where you're constantly using your head and there's risk there, right? So even if the re-injury risk is low, there's still the aspect of will De Bruyne be confident in those challenges.
Yeah, I mean, for me, in terms of the data that we actually hold, there are very few orbital fractures referenced on the Premier Injuries website. One that I did manage to come across was Gabriel Jesus. I think that was back in 2017 or 2018, and he spent around about a month on the sideline. So in terms of, there's positives there, certainly, because it looked as if it could have been a pretty serious injury. But if we're surmising that Kevin De Bruyne is maybe out of those, at least the first game, possibly the second, then the onus certainly will fall on the likes of Romelu Lukaku to step up, but also Eden Hazard. Now, we know, his form and his availability since he's left Stamford Bridge and went to the Santiago Bernabeu. He hasn't been great. There have been question marks with regards to his fitness. He seems to have picked up injury after injury after injury, some of them quite serious. Thinking, and I've looked at Eden Hazard as part of my fantasy team, so obviously I've got a little bit of a vested interest in that. But from the outside looking in, should we be concerned about Eden Hazard, and what would be maybe your projections in terms of being able to start games and impose himself and dominate and control games like the Eden Hazard that we know?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tough because, like you said, he has, extensive injury history. I've done too many videos on the guy, and then you're looking at his injury history, especially the muscular soft tissue injuries, right? And there's even the concern that he wanted to get the hardware from his ankle removed, which didn't happen, which is why he's available now. I guess the positive news with him is that he did play some consistent extent of games with Real to end the season. Whereas before, he was almost getting injured in training and was never able to come back. So that does bode well. The question then becomes, what's his fitness like? Can he sustain a high level of play in a high intensity competition, especially now if De Bruyne is out with all eyes on him, right? That's the question. And so I think it's a high risk, high reward for choosing him, because we know who Hazard is when he's healthy, when he's fit. But is he there? Maybe.
Given that we know that Roberto Martinez is, well practiced in physiotherapy, sports therapy, and sports science as well, and given that Belgium, on paper at least, have a relatively easy group, Group B, Finland, Russia, Denmark is probably the one that would tax them most.
Yep.
Do you think maybe Martinez would look to target those group games and start Eden Hazard, in the view that we'll get 50, 60 minutes and build him up? Or do you think he may be a little bit more conservative in his approach and think, well, we'll introduce him with 15 or 20 minutes to go and then gradually sort of increase that?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the assessments during training and with the physios that they're seeing right now in the buildup, right? If he's been able to play, if he's been able to practice and train and playing games, especially after the season, and he didn't have any physical issues, then it might indicate to Martinez, okay, he's now able to withstand a start and play that 60 to 70 minutes. Now, if he's having some minor muscular soreness and discomfort and issues, then it may indicate to Martinez, okay, maybe he's on that brink of that high risk, red zone, or higher risk for re-injury. So that's what it really comes down to. We haven't had any information on that though.
Yeah, excellent. And finally, Raj, I want to talk about a topic that, again, it's rearing its ugly head, and that's COVID. And the reason I bring this up, just in the last sort of week or so, we've had a little spike in the number of players who are now currently self-isolating. Sweden have announced 2 in Dejan Kuvalevski and Matthias Svanberg. And then also on Sunday, the Spanish Football Federation announced that Sergio Busquets went into self-isolation. And then only on Tuesday evening, Diego Llorente from Leeds, he's also tested positive. Now, Luis Enrique has called up an additional 6 players into the squad, and they're going to train away from the main group in what he called a parallel bubble, and that's to maybe mitigate any issues around, should any more players test positive. Now, for me, it's there is still hope that all of those players will still have some kind of involvement in the tournament. But are there any sort of risk factors associated with players maybe coming off the back of COVID straight into that, again, that high level, highly competitive environment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the biggest issue is fitness when you're coming back, right? Obviously, it depends on the severity of how that person responds to COVID. We've seen even some of these healthy players have issues, like Paul Pogba touched on, that he was having breathing issues for months after he got back, right? So it depends on that severity. So naturally, you're going to have it certainly could. Now, if they're asymptomatic, then they could definitely, it's going to be less of a reacclimation. But yeah, it certainly could. Anytime you go from limited activity to high intensity, right, it's increasing your risk. And then it becomes a matter of, okay, how much is acceptable risk?
Yeah. So certainly want to err on the side of caution with fantasy managers if they're looking to go down the route. And yeah, let's hopefully these secure bubbles, limit the spread of COVID, and we have a relatively COVID-free tournament, which is what we all want.
Yeah, I think I just heard today that the Spanish FA is trying to get all the players vaccinated now. I think I read that. I don't know if it's true or not.
Yeah, and if that's the case, is it almost, you're shutting the door when the horse is already bolted? Because the research will tell us that it's not really until you get that second jab, which could be anywhere between between 6 or 8 and maybe up to 12 weeks, depending on which country you live in and which government want to tell you. Really, that's would a vaccination at this point have any real impact on minimizing the risk of, because you still have transmission, am I right? It's only that you just have it minimizes the actual symptoms that a player may suffer. So it could be that players are still testing positive anyway, but maybe symptoms are less and they could maybe keep themselves in a little bit better condition and continue to train in the main group. Is that what be the main advantage of doing so?
Yeah, I think it would help mitigate some of the symptoms, and then transmission wise, it depends on what this is. Again, from what I've read, this is not my expertise by any means. What I've read with the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, they actually are so effective. They essentially pretty much prevent transmission because they're so effective. Now, the one dose, I don't know what it is in those countries, but in the US, Johnson & Johnson primarily, it still takes 2 weeks to become applicable, right? To your point.
Yeah.
So that's the question, really, is doing it now, last second. It's almost like they're panicking. Oh, I should have thought about this about 2 weeks ago. But
yeah. Listen, Raj, as always, it's been fantastic talking to you. If you don't know this guy, you should. It's Raj Brar from 3CB Performance. Produces a hell of a lot of quality content, not just on football, soccer, basketball, and not just injuries. There's tactics analysis, and there's all sorts of things covered on his website and through his YouTube channel. So please check him out. We will be back. Raj doesn't know that I'll have him back, but I'm announcing it live on air. So we will have you back as the tournament progresses, Raj, because like I say, we love you so much. And it's great to hear your insight and thoughts on the tournament. So yes, but for now, I'd like to thank you once again for joining us. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your day, Raj. Appreciate that.